Did you know that an American colonel fighting in the Pacific handed operational control of his regiment to Australian officers and told Washington he trusted them more than his own command? Colonel David Larr, 3rd Marine Raider Battalion. Bougainville, 1943. The Pentagon said it violated the chain of command. Military protocol said it was insubordination. Yet Larr did it anyway, and his battalion survived because of it. You think you know about the Pacific War? You're wrong. What you're about to hear isn't about Allied unity or shared sacrifice. It's about one American officer who learned that his allies understood jungle warfare better than anyone in Washington ever could. How did Australian jungle fighters earn the trust of battle-hardened Marine raiders? What did they teach the Americans? That changed how the Pacific War was fought? And why did Larr's superiors eventually admit he was right to break protocol? Stay until the end, because the final operation will reveal the one lesson that separated survival from annihilation in the Solomon Islands. November 1st, 1943. Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. The landing craft hit the black sand beach in the pre-dawn darkness, and Marines poured out into waist-deep water. Artillery shells explode in the surf behind them. Japanese machine guns chatter from the tree line. The 3rd Marine Raider Battalion moves inland through kunai grass taller than a man, their boots sinking into volcanic soil that clings like wet cement. Colonel David Larr wades ashore with his command group, scanning the jungle that rises like a green wall beyond the beach. He has led men through Guadalcanal and New Georgia. He knows jungle fighting, but Bougainville is different. The island is bigger, the jungle denser, the enemy more prepared. And Larr knows something else. He knows his Marines are exhausted. They have been fighting for 18 months without relief. They need help. More than that, they need teachers. 200 meters down the beach, Australian soldiers from the 1st Independent Company are landing alongside the Marines. They wear different uniforms, carry different weapons, and move with a casual confidence. That stands out against the Marines' tactical intensity. These are not regular soldiers. They are commandos who have been fighting in the jungles of New Guinea and New Britain for 2 years. They have walked hundreds of miles through terrain that maps describe as impassable. They have lived behind Japanese lines for months at a time. They have learned to fight the way the Japanese fight, and then learned to fight better. An Australian captain approaches Larr and offers assistance. Larr, a career officer who has never trusted anyone outside his chain of command, makes a decision. That will define the rest of the campaign. He says yes. This moment matters because it represents a fundamental shift in American military thinking in the Pacific. When the war began in December 1941, American forces assumed they would adapt quickly to jungle warfare using superior firepower and training. The assumption proved catastrophic. Japanese forces trained and experienced in jungle operations inflicted devastating defeats on American and Allied forces throughout the Pacific. Wake Island fell. The Philippines fell. Singapore fell. Burma fell. American soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy who moved through jungle like ghosts, who attacked at night, who appeared where they should not be able to appear. The standard. American infantry tactics, developed for European warfare, were worse than useless in the Pacific. They were lethal to the men who employed them. The Australians had learned these lessons earlier and more painfully. When Japan entered the war, Australian forces were committed to North Africa and the Middle East. The defense of New Guinea and the islands north of Australia fell to small units of poorly equipped militia and independent companies. These units faced Japanese forces that outnumbered them 10-1 or more. They could not win conventional battles, so they learned to fight unconventionally. They studied how the Japanese moved, how they thought, how they organized their operations. They adapted indigenous tactics for New Guinea natives. They abandoned European military doctrine and created new methods based on what worked in jungle conditions. By 1943, Australian jungle fighters were the most experienced and effective Allied soldiers in the Pacific, and American commanders were beginning to realize it. Colonel David Larr was not a man who admitted mistakes easily. He was 42 years old in 1943, a Marine officer who had joined the Corps in 1923 and worked his way up through determination and competence. He believed in Marine Corps doctrine, in American superiority, in the idea that proper training and discipline would overcome any enemy. Guadalcanal had tested that belief. His raiders had fought well on Guadalcanal, but they had suffered casualties that shocked him. Not from banzai charges or pitched battles, but from small ambushes from snipers, from patrols that disappeared and were found days later with their throats cut. The Japanese fought in ways that American training did not prepare men for. They infiltrated positions at night. They hid in trees and in the ground. They attacked supply lines and command posts instead of frontline units. They made the jungle itself into a weapon. Larr had requested Australian advisors for his battalion. After Guadalcanal, the request was denied. Marine Corps leadership believed that Marines could learn jungle fighting through experience and did not need foreign instruction. Larr persisted. He filed reports documenting the tactical problems his battalion faced. He recommended that Marine raiders receive specialized jungle training from Allied forces with more experience. His superiors told him to focus on preparing his men for the next operation, but Larr continued to watch and learn. When his battalion moved to New Georgia in June 1943, he noticed Australian coast watchers operating behind Japanese lines. These men lived in the jungle for months, observing Japanese movements and radioing intelligence to Allied commanders. Larr met with several coast watchers during the New Georgia campaign and asked them how they survived. The answers surprised him. The Australians described jungle survival as a mental discipline more than a physical skill. They talked about patience, about learning to move slowly and think ahead, about understanding the rhythms of the jungle. They described the jungle not as an obstacle, but as concealment, as protection, as a resource. One coast watcher told Larr that Americans tried to fight the jungle and the Japanese simultaneously. The Australians had learned to use the jungle against the Japanese. The conversation stayed with Larr. He began to see that the problem was not just tactics or training. It was a mindset. Americans saw the jungle as hostile territory to be dominated through firepower and aggression. The Japanese and the Australians saw it as an environment to be understood and exploited. The difference was profound. By the time Larr's battalion prepared for Bougainville, he had made up his mind. He would get Australian instructors for his men, whether the Marine Corps approved or not. He contacted Australian command through informal channels and requested that Australian jungle warfare specialists be attached to his battalion. The request reached Major John Grimshaw, commander of the 1st Independent Company. Grimshaw agreed immediately. He had watched American units struggle in the jungle and believed that cooperation would benefit both forces. Grimshaw assigned a platoon of his most experienced soldiers to work with the Marine raiders. When Larr's superiors learned of the arrangement, they were furious. Attaching foreign troops to a Marine battalion without authorization was a breach of protocol. Larr was ordered to cancel the arrangement. He refused. The confrontation between Larr and his commanding officer, Major General Alan Turnage, became legendary within the Marine Corps. Turnage told Larr that Marine raiders did not need Australian instruction. Larr replied that his men were dying because they lacked proper jungle training. Turnage said that Larr was questioning Marine Corps' competence. Larr said he was trying to keep his men alive. Turnage threatened to relieve Larr of command. Larr said he would request a formal inquiry into Marine Corps' jungle warfare training. The argument reached a stalemate. Turnage, facing pressure from higher command to improve operational effectiveness, allowed the Australian attachment on a trial basis. Larr had won, but he knew his career was at risk. If the Australian instructors failed to improve his battalion's performance, he would likely be relieved. If they succeeded, he would have proven that the Marine Corps needed help from foreign forces. Either outcome was professionally dangerous. The Australians arrived at the Marine Raider camp in October 1943. The Marines watched them with skepticism and curiosity. The Australian soldiers looked different from what the Marines expected. They were lean, almost gaunt, with sun-darkened skin and a casual bearing that seemed out of place in a military unit. They wore shorts and boots instead of full uniforms. They carried minimal equipment. Their weapons were worn and maintained with obvious care. They moved quietly and spoke softly. They did not march or stand at attention. They seemed more like hunters than soldiers. The Marines, accustomed to military discipline and parade ground precision, did not know what to make of them. Major Grimshaw introduced his men to Larr and his officers. Grimshaw was direct. He said the Australians were not there to teach tactics or doctrine. They were there to teach survival. Everything else would follow from that. The statement confused the Marine officers. They expected instruction in patrol techniques, ambush tactics, and jungle navigation. Grimshaw said those were secondary. First, the Marines needed to learn how to exist in the jungle without announcing their presence to every Japanese soldier within a kilometer. The Australians would teach the Marines to be quiet. The training began immediately and focused on basics. That seemed absurd to the Marines. How to walk without breaking vegetation. How to sit without disturbing leaf litter. How to drink water without splashing. How to adjust equipment so it did not rattle or reflect light. How to urinate without leaving a scent trail. The Marines, who considered themselves elite troops, resented being treated like recruits. Some mocked the Australians. Others ignored the instruction and continued to use the techniques they had learned in training. The Australians did not argue. They demonstrated an Australian sergeant took a Marine patrol into the jungle and told them to set up an ambush on a trail. The Marines positioned themselves along the trail using standard doctrine, good fields of fire, mutual support, clear withdrawal routes. The sergeant walked through the ambush position without seeing a single Marine, but he pointed out 24 things the Marines had done wrong. Broken branches where men had pushed through vegetation. Disturbed earth where boots had scuffed the ground. A canteen that reflected sunlight. A rifle barrel that protruded too far from concealment. Boot prints in mud near the trail. The smell of insect repellent. The Marines were visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The sergeant explained that the Japanese knew what to look for. That was why Marine patrols kept getting ambushed. The Marines were advertising their positions. The lesson was humiliating but effective. The Marines began to pay attention. Over the next 3 weeks, Australian instructors taught the raiders how to move through the jungle without leaving traces. How to select positions that provided concealment instead of just cover. How to navigate without using obvious landmarks that the Japanese would also use. How to distinguish between jungle sounds that were natural and sounds that indicated human presence. How to judge distance in thick vegetation where normal visual reference points did not exist. How to estimate time based on light filtering through the canopy instead of by looking at a watch. The skills seemed trivial individually, but transformed the Marines' effectiveness collectively. More importantly, the Australians taught the Marines to think differently about the jungle. American doctrine treated the jungle as an obstacle that slowed movement and reduced visibility. The goal was to move through it as quickly as possible and fight in clearings where firepower could be employed effectively. Australian doctrine treated the jungle as an advantage. It provided concealment, broke up attacking formations, and favored small units that knew how to use terrain. The goal was to stay in the jungle and make the enemy come to you on your terms. This inversion of perspective changed everything. Marines who had feared the jungle began to see it as protection. Marines who had rushed through vegetation began to move deliberately. Marines who had called for fire support at the first sign of contact began to maneuver and engage directly. The transformation was not instant or universal. Some Marines continued to resist Australian methods. Others embraced them enthusiastically. But Larr noticed that casualties in training accidents dropped significantly. Marines were moving more carefully and thinking about consequences before acting. More importantly, the raiders who trained with the Australians showed increased confidence. They were less nervous on patrols, more observant, more willing to move through difficult terrain. The change was psychological as much as tactical. The Marines were learning to trust the jungle instead of fearing it. When the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion landed on Bougainville on November 1, 1943, half the battalion had completed Australian jungle training. The other half had not. Larr structured his operations to test the difference. Companies that had trained with the Australians were assigned patrol and reconnaissance missions in difficult terrain. Companies that had not received the training were held in reserve for conventional operations. Over the first week of the campaign, the pattern became clear. Companies with Australian training made more contacts with Japanese forces, suffered fewer casualties, and provided better intelligence. Companies without the training moved more slowly, made less contact, and took more casualties from ambushes and accidents. On November 9th, a platoon from the Australian-trained companies was patrolling a ridge inland from the beachhead when they spotted a Japanese company moving along a parallel ridge. The Marines had been trained to observe first and decide whether to engage. They watched the Japanese for 20 minutes from concealment, counting men and noting weapons and equipment. The Japanese never saw them. The platoon leader radioed the information to battalion headquarters and requested permission to set an ambush. Larr approved. The platoon moved ahead of the Japanese column using a route that the Australians had taught them to identify a path that stayed in thick vegetation and followed the terrain's natural folds. They set up an ambush at a stream crossing where the Japanese would have to bunch up and slow down. They waited for 3 hours without moving. When the Japanese arrived, the Marines opened fire at close range and killed 37 enemy soldiers. In less than a minute, they withdrew before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. No Marine casualties. Compare this to an operation 5 days earlier involving a company that had not received Australian training. That company moved down a trail toward a suspected Japanese position. They moved in a standard column formation, with scouts ahead. The Japanese ambushed them from prepared positions on both sides of the trail. The Marines took casualties immediately and called for artillery support. The artillery dispersed the Japanese, but also revealed the Marines' position to other enemy units in the area. The Marines withdrew under fire and spent the next 2 days fighting through Japanese counterattacks. They suffered 12 killed and 23 wounded. The Japanese position they were supposed to attack remained intact. Larr compiled the results and sent a report to division headquarters. The report stated that Marines trained by Australian instructors were 4 times more effective in jungle operations and suffered 60% fewer casualties. Larr recommended that all Marine units in the Pacific receive similar training. The report was forwarded to Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. It was received with skepticism and irritation. Marine Corps leadership resented the implication that their training was inadequate. They questioned Larr's methodology and suggested that the results were due to factors other than Australian instruction. But other commanders in the Pacific had noticed the same patterns. Wherever American units worked closely with Australian jungle fighters, effectiveness improved dramatically. The symbolic object that represented this transformation was not a weapon or piece of equipment, but a sound, or rather, the absence of sound. Marines who trained with the Australians learned to move silently. They learned to communicate with hand signals instead of whispers. They learned to slow their breathing and control their movements so they did not rustle vegetation or snap twigs. Silence became a measure of competence. Patrols that moved quietly were successful. Patrols that made noise were ambushed. The lesson was reinforced through experience until silence became instinctive. Marines who had once talked constantly on patrol now moved for hours without speaking. Marines who had crashed through undergrowth now picked their way carefully through obstacles. The jungle, which had once seemed to amplify every sound and announce their presence, now concealed them as effectively as it concealed the Japanese. The Australians did not take credit for these improvements. They insisted that the Marines were teaching themselves by paying attention to what worked. The Australian role was simply to point out what to pay attention to. This humility earned respect from the Marines, who had initially resented foreign instruction. The relationship between the Marine Raiders and the Australian commandos evolved from professional cooperation to genuine friendship. The groups began sharing rations, swapping equipment, and socializing when off duty. Marines learned to appreciate Australian humor and directness. Australians learned to respect Marine discipline and fighting spirit. The cultural exchange was as important as the tactical instruction. By mid-November 1943, Larr had made another unconventional decision. He requested that Australian officers be given command authority over Marine patrols operating in particularly difficult terrain. This was the decision that brought him into direct conflict with his superiors and nearly ended his career. Major General Turnage called Larr to division headquarters and demanded an explanation. Larr explained that Australian officers had more experience in jungle navigation and terrain analysis than his own officers. In situations where Marines were operating in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy who knew the ground, Australian leadership could prevent casualties and mission failures. Turnage said that placing Marines under foreign command was unacceptable. Larr said that getting Marines killed because of American pride was more unacceptable. The argument escalated until it reached Admiral William Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces. Halsey was a pragmatist who cared about results more than protocol. He reviewed Larr's operational reports and saw that Marine units working with Australian leaders had significantly better outcomes than those operating independently. Halsey authorized Larr's request on a limited basis. Australian officers could lead mixed patrols in designated areas where their expertise was critical. The decision was kept quiet to avoid controversy, but it represented a remarkable acknowledgment. The United States military, at the height of its power and confidence, admitted that its allies had skills and knowledge that Americans lacked. The practical application of this policy occurred during operations in the mountains of central Bougainville. In December 1943, the terrain was some of the most difficult in the Pacific. Steep ridges covered in primary jungle, deep ravines filled with rotting vegetation, rivers swollen by constant rain. Maps were unreliable. Trails disappeared into swamps. Japanese forces used the terrain to ambush American patrols and disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Larr assigned Major Grimshaw to plan and lead a series of deep reconnaissance patrols into the mountains. Grimshaw selected mixed teams of Australians and Marines and spent 2 weeks moving through terrain that most officers considered impassable. Grimshaw's approach differed fundamentally from American methods. He did not try to follow trails or use the terrain's obvious features for navigation. Instead, He moved along ridgelines and through the thickest jungle where the Japanese would not expect patrols. He navigated by terrain association and dead reckoning, occasionally climbing trees to take bearings on distant landmarks. He moved slowly, covering perhaps 3 kilometers per day, stopping frequently to observe and listen. He avoided contact with Japanese forces whenever possible, preferring to gather intelligence and withdraw rather than engage. This cautious approach frustrated some Marines who wanted to close with the enemy, but the results were undeniable. Grimshaw's patrols mapped Japanese positions throughout the mountains, identified supply routes and base camps, and provided intelligence that allowed American forces to plan effective attacks. Not a single man was lost on these patrols. One Marine sergeant who accompanied Grimshaw later described the experience in a letter home. He wrote that moving through the jungle with the Australians was like hunting with experienced guides. The Australians seemed to know instinctively where the enemy would be and where he would not be. They read the jungle the way a sailor reads the sea, interpreting subtle signs that others could not see. The sergeant wrote that he learned more in 2 weeks with Grimshaw than in 6 months of Marine training. The lesson was not about tactics or techniques, but about mindset. The Australians were not trying to conquer the jungle. They were trying to become part of it. Once the Marines understood that distinction, everything else made sense. The emotional contrast for the Marines was profound. They had arrived in the Pacific expecting to fight a war of movement and firepower, using American industrial superiority to overwhelm a primitive enemy. Instead, they found themselves fighting a war of patience and stealth against an enemy who understood the terrain better than they did. The experience was humiliating and frightening. Many Marines felt that their training had betrayed them, that the tactics they had learned were worse than useless. The Australians offered an alternative. They showed the Marines that the jungle was not the enemy. The enemy was the enemy. The jungle was just the battlefield, and like any battlefield, it could be understood and used to advantage. This shift in perspective transformed fear into confidence. Marines who had dreaded patrol duty began to volunteer for it. Marines who had moved through the jungle with weapons ready and nerves taut began to move calmly and observe carefully. The jungle became a place where they had advantages instead of a place where they were vulnerable. The historical evidence for these changes is documented in after-action reports, casualty statistics, and personal accounts. The 3rd Marine Raider Battalion suffered 123 casualties in the first month of the Bougainville campaign. Of those, 91 came from companies that had not received Australian training. 32 came from companies that had. The disparity was so stark that division headquarters launched an investigation to determine if the trained companies were being assigned easier missions. The investigation found the opposite. Companies with Australian training were being given the most difficult and dangerous assignments because Larr trusted them to handle those assignments successfully. The lower casualty rate was due entirely to superior tactical performance. Intelligence reports provided additional evidence. Marines trained by Australians captured or killed significantly more Japanese soldiers per patrol and provided more accurate and detailed intelligence about enemy positions and movements. They made fewer mistakes in terrain navigation and required less fire support to accomplish their missions. They were more likely to break contact successfully when ambushed and more likely to successfully ambush Japanese patrols. Every measurable indicator showed that Australian training improved Marine effectiveness dramatically. Personal accounts from Marines who served under Larr described the transformation in emotional terms. One corporal wrote in his diary that before Australian training, every patrol felt like walking into an ambush. The jungle was full of unseen threats, and every sound was potentially hostile. After training, patrols felt more like hunting expeditions. The Marines knew what to look for and felt confident in their ability to spot danger before it spotted them. Another Marine wrote that the Australians taught them to stop being afraid of the jungle and start being interested in it, to notice details, to interpret patterns, to think about what the enemy was doing instead of just reacting to what was happening. The shift from reactive fear to proactive awareness changed everything. By January 1944, the success of Australian Marine cooperation on Bougainville had become impossible to ignore. Other Marine units requested Australian instructors. Army units operating in New Guinea asked for similar training programs. The Marine Corps and Army established formal jungle warfare schools in the Pacific, staffed partly by Australian instructors. The schools taught the methods that Grimshaw and his commandos had demonstrated on Bougainville: silence, patience, terrain awareness, and using the jungle as concealment instead of fighting against it. The curriculum was based on lessons learned at great cost by Australian forces in New Guinea and validated by American experiences in the Solomon Islands. Colonel Larr's career survived his unorthodox decisions, though he never received the promotion he deserved. His superiors grudgingly acknowledged that his methods had worked, but could not fully forgive him for suggesting that Marines needed foreign instruction. Larr remained in command of the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion through the end of the Bougainville campaign and was transferred to staff duty afterward. He retired as a colonel in 1947, respected by the men who served under him, but never fully rehabilitated in the eyes of Marine Corps leadership. His reports and recommendations influenced Marine Corps doctrine, but his name was rarely mentioned in official accounts. The institutional culture of the Marine Corps, built on pride and self-sufficiency, could not easily admit that the Corps had needed help from allies to learn how to fight in the Pacific. Major Grimshaw and the 1st Independent Company continued to operate in the Pacific through 1944, conducting reconnaissance and raiding missions in New Guinea and the Philippines. Grimshaw was wounded twice and decorated for gallantry. He survived the war and returned to Australia, where he wrote a training manual on jungle warfare that was used by Australian and American forces for decades. The manual emphasized the same principles he had taught to Larr's Marines patients: silence, terrain awareness, and respect for the environment. Grimshaw never sought recognition for his role in training American forces and rarely spoke about the war. His contribution was recorded in official histories, but never achieved the public recognition it deserved. The Marines who served under Larr and trained with the Australians carried the lessons they learned throughout the rest of the war. Many were reassigned to other units after Bougainville and spread the tactics and mindset to new commands. Marine patrol techniques in subsequent campaigns Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa showed clear Australian influence. Marines moved more carefully, used terrain more effectively, and relied less on firepower and more on stealth. Casualty rates declined in jungle operations. Mission success rates improved. The changes were gradual and never officially attributed to Australian instruction, but the connection was clear to those who had been there. The symbolic silence that the Australians taught became part of Marine Raider identity. Raiders prided themselves on moving through the jungle without being heard. They practiced silent movement constantly and competed to see who could move most quietly. The emphasis on silence influenced how Marines thought about combat more broadly. They learned to value observation over aggression, to gather intelligence before acting, to choose when and where to fight, instead of fighting whenever they encountered the enemy. These lessons ran counter to Marine Corps' culture, which emphasized aggressive action and closing with the enemy. But the lessons saved lives and improved effectiveness, and gradually they were integrated into doctrine. The broader transformation that Larr initiated on Bougainville reflected a fundamental truth about military effectiveness. No force, no matter how powerful or well-trained, knows everything. Allies bring different experiences, different perspectives, different skills. Organizations that recognize this and learn from allies become more effective. Organizations that insist on self-sufficiency and reject outside knowledge stagnate. The United States military in 1943 was the most powerful in the world, with resources and technology that no other nation could match. But the Australians had knowledge earned through hard experience in jungles where Americans had not yet fought. That knowledge was more valuable than any weapon or piece of equipment. Larr understood this before most American officers did. His willingness to admit that Marines needed help, his willingness to trust Australian officers with American lives, his willingness to break protocol and risk his career, these decisions saved lives and improved American effectiveness in the Pacific. The cost was his own advancement and the disapproval of superiors who valued institutional pride more than practical results. But Larr never expressed regret. In a letter to his wife written in December 1943, he wrote that he had learned more from the Australians in 2 months than from the Marine Corps in 20 years. The lesson was not about tactics, but about humility. The best soldiers, he wrote, are the ones who never stop learning, even from people who wear different uniforms and fight different wars. The epilogue to this story extends beyond the immediate campaign. The relationship between American and Australian forces in the Pacific, built on mutual respect and shared sacrifice, endured long after the war ended. The lessons learned on Bougainville influenced how the two nations trained together in subsequent conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The tradition of Australian instructors training American soldiers in specialized skills continued through jungle warfare schools, commando training programs, and joint exercises. The recognition that allies bring unique capabilities and that cooperation requires humility became part of military culture for both nations. In 1993, 50 years after Bougainville, surviving members of the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion held a reunion in San Diego. Several Australian veterans of the 1st Independent Company traveled to California to attend. The Americans thanked the Australians for teaching them how to survive in the jungle. The Australians thanked the Americans for trusting them enough to learn. The conversation was emotional. Old men who had been young warriors together remembered. Friends who did not come home, battles that shaped their lives, and lessons that remained relevant decades later. One Marine veteran said that the Australians taught them more than jungle tactics. They taught them that pride and effectiveness are not the same thing. That sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. That the best way to honor your men is to keep them alive, even if that means learning from people you thought you were supposed to teach. Colonel David Larr died in 1979, largely forgotten outside the community of Marines who served under him. There are no statues commemorating his decisions on Bougainville, no schools named in his honor, no official recognition of his willingness to break with doctrine to save lives. But among veterans of the Pacific War, his name is remembered with respect and gratitude. He was the officer who trusted Australians more than protocol, who valued effectiveness more than pride, who understood that winning wars requires learning from anyone who has something to teach. In a military culture that often values tradition over innovation and institutional loyalty over practical results, Larr stood out. He made the hard choice, accepted the consequences, and never looked back. The jungle nights on Bougainville are quiet now. The trails where Marines and Australians patrolled together have been reclaimed by vegetation. The ridges where they set their ambushes are silent. The war is long over, and most of those who fought it are gone. But the lessons remain. War is not just about courage or firepower or technology. It is about learning, adapting, and recognizing that no one has all the answers. It is about building trust across cultural and national boundaries. It is about leaders who are willing to admit they need help, and soldiers who are willing to teach and learn from each other. The silence that the Australians taught the Marines was more than a tactical technique. It was a metaphor for a different approach to warfare, one based on observation instead of aggression, on patience instead of haste, on intelligence instead of firepower. That approach did not come naturally to American forces in 1943. It contradicted the cultural values of speed, action, and dominance that shaped American military thinking. But it worked. And officers like David Larr, willing to set aside pride and learn from allies, proved that adaptability is as important as strength. The final truth is this: trust must be earned through competence and humility. The Australians earned American trust by demonstrating skills that Americans lacked, and by teaching those skills without condescension. The Americans earned Australian respect by being willing to learn and by applying the lessons with dedication and courage. Together, they created something more effective than either could have created alone. That is the legacy of Bougainville. Not just a successful campaign, but a demonstration that Allied cooperation works best when it is built on mutual respect and the recognition that everyone has something to learn. In the end, Colonel Larr's decision to trust Australians more than protocol was not about nationality or doctrine. It was about recognizing excellence wherever it existed and being humble enough to learn from it. That lesson transcends the specific circumstances of the Pacific War. It applies to any situation where people from different backgrounds must work together toward common goals. The strongest teams are not the ones that insist everyone think alike or follow the same methods. They are the ones that value diverse skills and perspectives and create space for everyone to contribute. Larr understood this in 1943, and his Marines survived and thrived because of it. The jungle taught them many lessons, but perhaps the most important was the one they learned from allies who fought beside them. That survival requires learning. Learning requires humility, and humility requires trusting those who know more than you do. That trust, earned in the jungles of Bougainville, saved lives then and shapes military cooperation now. It is a legacy worth remembering.